Hey guys, we just want to make a quick video for you guys talking a little more in depth about your axillary artery and the branches of the axillary artery. This is going to be really important in terms of the axilla of the arm in lab, but also this is very highly tested in lecture, like everything is. So we just know that when we were learning this, we felt like maybe the way it was presented in lecture was a little confusing. So we just wanted to break it down really simply. And to do that, we want to back all the way up and think about, so if you're looking up here, you should have a good range that this is our axilla. We have our first rib right here. Here's your clavicle going down to your humerus. And then I have a couple of muscles denoted that I'll talk about later. But once we're in the axilla, we are starting up here with our subclavian artery. And I know in my head, I was very confused as to where did the subclavian artery even come from. So just going back over here, this is around the heart. So we have our aortic arch that comes off of our heart. That would be like right here. So we have the big aortic arch, or just aorta, and that gives off three things real quick. Your left subclavian artery is a direct branch of the aorta, your left common carotid artery, and then you have something called your brachiocephalic trunk, which is going to be a lot bigger, and that's because this guy splits into our right common carotid and our right subclavian. So I know I ran through that quickly. You can rewatch it if you need to, but I just wanted to give you a frame of reference that we start the aorta, come up our brachiocephalic trunk, and then that's where we get our right subclavian, and then that's where we're zooming into the axilla as this guy continued over here, just to give a reference of where we're coming from. So here is our right subclavian artery. And you guys should know by now we have a couple of boundaries for how this one vessel is going to change names. So at the lateral border of our first rib, the subclavian artery now becomes the axillary artery, just changes names. And then we continue down. We have a lot of branches off that we'll get into in a minute, but that continues down. And at the inferior border of our teres major muscle, it's going to change names to our brachial artery. And then Evan's going to jump in later and talk about the anastomoses and branches of that. But that's kind of the borders. I drew those in kind of a mint color to know, and they will ask you questions about that on the exam, knowing that the lateral border of your first rib and the inferior border of the teres major are going to be those borders for name changes. So then zooming into just our axillary artery, we know that we have several branches off of that are very important, and they're intermingled with our brachial plexus. So this is what you guys are working on in lab right now. So we have an acronym for that we like to use. It should be on the Google Drive, but I'll go through it right now, called Screw the Lawyer, Save a Patient. And so this is really important to know which ones of these arteries are coming off in which region of our axillary artery. So just like we divided it to name change, we're going to divide just the axillary artery into three sections, and you need to know these boundaries. So the first part of our axillary artery is going to be in between our first rib and our pectoralis minor muscle, which is denoted in black right here. So that's the first section, and it's very easy. Off the first section, you have one vessel. Then we have the second section of our axillary artery, and that's going to be deep or behind our pectoralis minor, which is why I've drawn it dashed. So underneath your pec minor, if you flip that up, in the second section, you're going to have two vessels. And then our third section of our axillary artery, we will have, you guessed it, three vessels. And that section is between this lateral border of pec minor all the way down until we change to brachial. So lateral border of pec minor to the inferior border of teres major is going to be your third section, and these three things come off of that. So knowing those boundaries is very important, because they could ask you something like, which one of these does not come off in the second section of your axillary artery, etc. And it's also important in lab too, knowing that if I put the pec minor down and they've tagged something that's deep to pec minor, there's a good chance that it's going to be one of these two vessels. So just zooming in on the acronym, we have Screw the Lawyer, Save a Patient. And then in the first section, we have our superior thoracic artery, and that's going to be the only thing, should be the only thing coming off in the first section of our axillary. He's going to run from your axillary to the, you guessed it, superior part of your thoracic wall. He tends to be kind of small, easily broken, but he's going to just run up to the very top of your chest, basically. Then in our second part, so deep to pectoralis minor, we're going to have two things. First is the thoracoacromial artery. This guy also has four branches that I'll get into in a second. And then we will have our lateral thoracic artery. Remember when we talked about brachial plexus, that is very easy to confuse long thoracic nerve from lateral thoracic artery. So just remember that this is lateral thoracic artery. And that is going to be running down to our serratus anterior muscle. And so you're going to be looking for the serrated knife muscle, and that's where he should be going. Going back to our thoracoacromial, he is going to have 4 branches, and I like to use the acronym All Dogs Can Pee. Some people like to do California Police Department, whatever works for you. But those 4 branches that we'll have isolated out in lab are going to be the acromial branch, the deltoid branch, clavicular branch, and pectoral branch. And these are all running towards the things that they're named for. So running towards your acromion, running towards your clavicle, your pectoralis muscles, things like that. The clavicular one is the one you need to watch out for. That is very, very hard to preserve. We do have it on the TA body, so I wouldn't be surprised if they do tag that. So just be looking out for something running back in the direction of your clavicle right here. So all dogs can pee comes off of your thoracoacromial. Don't get confused. These do not come directly off your axillary, though. They're a branch of the axillary. Then jumping over to the third section right here, once we move past pectoralis minor, we have subscapular. This is in general going to be your thickest branch of your axillary. It looks kind of like a trunk in and of itself. So he's going to be pretty thick, and then he gives off 2 things. Your circumflex scapular, which we know runs around to our triangular space, just a connection there. And then it splits into our thoracodorsal, which will run to our latissimus dorsi. I just keep the dorsal part of that in mind to remember what muscle it goes to, just like the nerve. So subscapular, pretty big, gives off circumflex scapular. That is going to circumflex around your humerus to go to your triangular space in thoracodorsal. Then we have our anterior and posterior circumflex humeral arteries. So anterior circumflex humeral is going to generally come off first, and it's going to be tinier. And then our posterior circumflex humeral is going to dip deep to our humerus, go around on the posterior side, and he's generally a little thicker. So those are just things to kind of help distinguish in lab. But generally you want to look for one that's running anterior or the posterior diving deep behind. And those are going to be the branches of your axillary artery. Go.
All right, what's up, guys? So jumping in a little bit more of a closer view of the cubital fossa region of your arm, we're going to be talking about further the brachial artery. And so after it changes name after axillary, you'll have your brachial artery here in the mid shaft of your humerus. And so just for reference, I know this looks like a big cluster right now, but we're looking at the right arm, this being the lateral side and medial side here. This would be your radius and your ulna here in the black. And so your brachial artery is denoted here in red. Is going to come down, and in your cubital fossa, it's going to split into both your radial artery and your ulnar artery. And so those are going to be pretty big players for your collateral circulation in this region. And so know, just as a point of reference, when we're talking about all these different anastomoses, you're going to have collateral arteries and recurrent arteries. And so your collateral arteries are going to be ones that are branching off more proximally in the humerus, and they're going to be coming down and anastomosing with the recurrent arteries that are more distally found in your radius and your ulnar region. And so looking off your brachial artery, one of the first things that comes off in this region is going to be your profunda brachii, or the deep artery of the arm. And so this artery is going to unmistakably go behind the humerus, as we've noted in the dotted lines, and it's going to split into 2 more arteries. And those are going to be called your middle collateral and your radial collateral arteries. And so here's your radial collateral. And this one is going to come down and anastomose with a recurrent artery, like we talked about, which is called your radial recurrent artery. Your radial recurrent, like you might guess, comes off of your radial artery. The other branch off profunda brachii is your middle collateral artery. Your middle collateral artery is going to go behind your humerus. This would be the posterior arm behind here. It's going to come down, and it's going to anastomose with your interosseous recurrent artery. Then flipping more on the medial side of your arm, off of your brachial artery, you're going to have a superior and an inferior ulnar collateral artery. These arteries are going to come down and anastomose with other recurrent arteries. These are going to be called your posterior and your anterior ulnar recurrent arteries. And just a quick little acronym, I guess, that you could use to remember those. I would always just remember AI and PS. And so your anterior ulnar recurrent is going to anastomose with the I, inferior ulnar collateral. And your posterior ulnar recurrent is going to anastomose with the S, superior ulnar collateral. And so when you're looking at these in lab, notice that both of them come off of your brachial artery. And your superior obviously is going to be more proximal, higher up. and it's going to go behind your medial epicondyle of your humerus, and it's going to come out and do that anastomosis with the posterior ulnar recurrent. Whereas your inferior ulnar collateral is going to stay anterior the whole time. It's not going to dive deep behind anything, and that's going to come down and anastomose with your anterior ulnar recurrent. And so I know this looks like a lot right now, but these are going to be really important anastomosis for lecture purposes, but also you're going to want to know what these arteries are going to look like, I guess relative in size, for lab purposes as well. A common misconception is that your profunda brachii comes off of the axillary artery, but this would be incorrect because you need to know that it's coming off of brachial after it changes names.